So good morning. Good morning. Everybody have your seats. Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to this session on recovery and reconstruction as part of the disaster management agenda. My name is Roger Morier. I'm going to be the moderator for the discussion this morning, and I think we have a pretty interesting series of sessions here for you to learn and to take away some important information. I have some minor housekeeping details. One is if you have a cell phone and if you have it on, now would be a good time to put it on vibrate or turn it off so we don't have an orchestra of cell phones ringing when this session is going on. And two, we want you to participate. There is a provision for audience participation. So in front of you, you should have some papers where you could write questions to ask the panelists or to ask people who are making presentations if you want to write your question down. If you want to be more modern, you can tweet your questions, so you can use your cell phones but keep them quiet, and you can tweet your questions to @GFDRR or use the hashtag recovery framework. And if you're really old-fashioned, then there's a way that you can send in your questions via email, and some of the questions may make it here, but some of the questions, they will all be answered. You send your questions to recoveryframework@gmail.com. And those questions will be answered on the website. So if you don't get the answers today, come back in a day or so and you will see the questions and the answers there as well. So let me begin. The focus today, as I said, is on recovery after a disaster. How recovery and reconstruction, if they're done the right way, can help to prevent serious damages in the future and damages to lives and to livelihoods, obviously, when disaster strikes. I think most people would agree that any recovery needs to be resilient. That's a key word. And the catchphrase, as you know, is building back better. Building infrastructure, building people's lives so that the next time something happens, the damages are less important. Now, after a disaster, governments are increasingly working with the international community on post-disaster needs assessment, the PDNA, and many countries have experience with this already, and some of those countries are going to be here to talk about that today. And that PDNA, that post-disaster needs assessment, can be seen as part of what is an evolving recovery framework, which the international community is moving towards, and we have experts here today to talk about that evolving recovery framework, how countries and international agencies can use the same language, use the same vocabulary, the same approach to building back better. So today, this session is in three parts. In the first part, we're going to have case studies from three countries. We're going to hear from Indonesia, from Japan, and from Pakistan. We're going to hear their experience in building back better and how they approached recovery and reconstruction after natural disasters in their country. So the first thing is to call on the representative from the government of Indonesia. That is Mr. Bambang Sulistianto, who is on my right. He is the Deputy Chief for Rehabilitation and Reconstruction for the National Disaster Mitigation Agency for the government of Indonesia. So Mr. Sulistiano, if you want to make your presentation, I welcome you. Now, I must say we have a certain amount of time for each presentation. We have representatives from Indonesia, Japan, and Pakistan. I have a watch, which is not from Indonesia, Japan, or Pakistan, but is from Switzerland. So I will use my Swiss watch to make sure that we stay on time, okay? Mr. Sulistiano.
Mrs. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present a case study in post-disaster recovery from my country, Indonesia. As evident, Indonesia has had a series of disaster through which it has been able to learn and make improvement in recovery and risk reduction. Indonesia has institutionalized recovery mechanisms which are involved over time. The Agency for the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction for Aceh and Nias, BRR, was set up to manage for post-tsunami and earthquake recovery in April 2006. The National Disaster Management Agency has been set up with the mandates and institutional recovery capacity for recovery. This is a minister's degree of late 2011, ensure that recovery and rehabilitation guidelines form the basis for all future post-disaster recovery effort. All this has led to the mainstream of a legal framework for recovery and risk reduction into national planning and budgeting, which has been key. This is the recovery scheme in our country. We start with an assessment, the post-disaster need assessment, PDNA, which integrate damage and loss assessment and human recovery need assessment. PDNA identifies early recovery and longer-term recovery needs towards sustainable development. It clarifies policy and regulatory framework and strategies, as well as resources allocated for the national government, local government, international partner, and the private sector. PDNA is the basis for formulation of the post-disaster rehabilitation and reconstruction action plan, which is usually implemented for 3 years. We involve the community through participatory planning, monitoring, and feedback mechanism. Community-based recovery had contributed to increase growth in the local economy. Mechanism such as the multi-donor fund for Aceh and Nias and the Java Reconstruction Fund, we established to pool in donor resources for past recovery effort. This is our current financing mechanism for recovery. With support from international development partner, Indonesia has established the Indonesian Donor Fund, IDF, as a standing mechanism to help fund implement to the government rehabilitation and reconstruction action plan. The government also allocated significant resources for recovery from the national budget. A minimum of 10% has to be allocated for DRR from the recovery budget. Indonesia PDNA process takes a longer-term view by identifying recovery strategies that are more sensitive to future community needs, identifies underlying development rate cause of, and take a forward planning perspective. Following the PDNA, the government will produce an action plan for rehabilitation and reconstruction, RENACSI, a nationally owned framework which clarifies recovery priorities, provide a framework for allocation of resources by both national and local government. In summary, Indonesia has learned a lot from past disaster and has developed the necessary policies, institutional, and capacities to implement and monitor recovery. The country has also allocated sufficient budget for recovery, and PDNA tool and methods adapted to the country's special context. This helps guide for disaster recovery to be more people-centered and community-driven. They will contribute to sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Sulistiano. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Let me now call upon the representative of the government of Japan, Mr. Yoshitami Kamioka, who is the Parliamentary Secretary for Disaster Management, who has flown here all the way from Tokyo just to be part of this session and to speak to you today. So, Mr. Kamioka, the floor is yours, and we will have, I believe, simultaneous translation.
I'm sorry, I speak Japanese. 日本の内閣府政務官の亀岡義民です。
Yoshitami Kameoka from the Japanese government, parliamentary minister. I'm happy to have an opportunity to speak with you. I would like to report about the recovery and reconstruction of Japan after the Great Japan earthquake in March 2011. The recovery and reconstruction from the earthquake, the number of dead and unaccounted for is more than 18,000, and the number of completely damaged houses is 130,000. It's been 2 years since the occurrence of the earthquake. The affected area is steadily recovering and making a reconstruction effort. The number of evacuees has reached to 470,000 at peak. But this year in April, it's reduced to 300,000. And most people have been living in temporary houses or at government housing. In terms of infrastructure, the government infrastructure, except for the areas that are damaged completely with a tsunami or the emergency evacuation area after the nuclear disaster, the emergency reconstruction have been complete. And disaster debris from tsunami has reached 60 million tons. So at the time of January this year, 46% of the debris of 60 million tons have been processed. So our issue now is to build the town, including the evacuation plan to the higher grounds, and also the employment and the business. And in Japan, there's a new agency, Reconstruction Agency, has been established, and that's based on the law in June 2011. And that's been also upgraded to the ministry from the task force. And the reconstruction agency is based in Japan, and they also have 3 areas, 3 agency bureaus in the affected area, plus 8 bureaus in other parts. And their staff member is 420 people. And it will be the one-stop shop for municipalities for all the assistance and a coordination point. As for the budget for the reconstruction, it's a total of 25 trillion yen. And the source for that money would come from tax increase for reconstruction, which will be 10.5 trillion. And also securing from a reduction of austerity measures, and it will be 8.5 trillion. But we also have affected areas, and they have special measures for tax and finances. So we need to support the reconstruction of the areas. So we also have set up a new subsidy system. We also trying to reduce red tape for implementation so that the municipality would have less burden. In terms of Fukushima, this is where my hometown. I am from Fukushima. The evacuation area is periodically reviewed. Still, we have 150,000 people evacuated from the area. For the reconstruction and rebuilding of Fukushima, Japan has enacted a new law in 2012. It's called Fukushima Reconstruction Law. And especially we are concerned about the children who are in an affected area. For the victim children, we also have enacted a new law to support children. And also, there is a new Fukushima Recovery Agency established in 2013, and that agency will review the evacuation area and also decontamination. So we are concerned that there's a huge area of decontamination necessary because the contamination of environment has been done in wide areas. So we also enacted a new law in 2012 in January. So we have prioritized some areas to do decontamination first. So also the earth from this decontamination is safely transported, stored, and processed. So we have learned lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake. And we have actually, last summer, a final report on lessons and issues. First of all, we should not have anything unanticipated in disaster response. And secondly, assistance is required according to the changing needs and diversity of affected people. And number three, the effort should be taken with local communities, citizens, and businesses and governments. So with that lesson, we are revising the disaster countermeasure basic acts. We need to reinforce the response for disaster and also respond to affected people quickly. Also, we have to improve the system to actually help the local governments and also to help the necessity needs transported quickly. So we are actually preparing to have a new legal framework to help the reconstruction quicker and better. And that actually includes our in advance of recurrence to establish construction headquarters, development of basic reconstruction guidelines. And at the same time, we're building a strategy called national resilience. This improves resistance and resilience with regard to large-scale disasters through comprehensive countermeasures with not only structural measures, but also non-structural measures. So we call it hard and soft policies. So the basic policy is to secure human lives by any means, and also significant functions should be maintained for government, economic, society. And also we need to mitigate the damage to property and facilities to prevent further damage. And also to enable quick recovery and construction. And that's the basic idea. So we would like to have the reconstruction with strength and flexibility. That is the summary of my report of the Japan's reconstruction recovery effort after the Great East Japan earthquake. Thank you very much. So we like to continue working hard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamioka. Thank you very much for that presentation. Let me now call upon Lieutenant General Nadim Ahmed, who is the former chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority and the former deputy chairman of the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority for the government of Pakistan. General Nadim.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. It's a proud privilege to present Pakistan's case study in a different backdrop where we had, and I'll try and compare the two disasters that we have handled. Ever since 2005, Pakistan has had to experience a series of disasters which included 3 earthquakes, we had 2 cyclones, we had 3 floods, we have 2 huge landslides, and we had a complex emergency going in our country. Every time we had a disaster, we had a PCNA done or a PDNA done. But the results of the recoveries are vastly different. And I'll try and find out as to why those results vary from very good to not so good. For the sake of brevity, I will take the two major disasters that we have handled. One is the earthquake of 2005, and the second is the floods of 2010. I know it's a busy slide, but I'll quickly go through the punchlines. In the earthquake of 2005, we had 3 million people which were affected, whereas in the floods, we had 20 million people who were affected, a population as big as that of Australia. In addition to 73,000 people being killed in the earthquake, we look at the area that was devastated. 30,000 square kilometers in the earthquake, vis-a-vis 100,000 square kilometers in the floods of 2010, and out of which 20% of the total arable land of Pakistan was underwater. The recovery costs were $5.5 billion vis-a-vis $10 billion in the floods. Now, in this, what we did in the earthquake of 2005, we created dedicated recovery structures with the name of Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority, whereas in the floods, we worked with the existing line departments, existing planning departments and line departments of the federal government and the provincial government. Now, with regard to the funding, there was dedicated funding for the earthquake of 2005, whereas in flood, there was the normal developmental funding that was used for the recovery effort. Third, the cash transfers in case of earthquake were conditional. If you make your house safe, you will get the money. Unlike in the floods where we just gave the money and did not put any conditionalities, thereby ending up with a lot of houses which were made at the same place in the floodplains. And that's the key point that I want to highlight. Now, after 2010 flood, when we had put in a lot of money in making those houses, we had floods in 2011 as well as in 2012. And what happened? These floods washed away all the investment that was done in the previous year. So the first key point that I want the audience to take away is that the recovery also has to be resilient. We keep on talking of mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development, but I think recovery has to be extremely resilient to be able to withstand the next disasters. Otherwise, you will keep falling back on your developmental objectives as well as the Millennium Development Goals, thereby proving the adage which says that the resilient recovery is a developmental imperative. Third thing, we had a very successful donor conference because it was held just in case of earthquake, just after 5 weeks of the earthquake. We did not have the same thing in the floods of 2010 where it was done after 5 months. Thereby, we lost the sympathy factor and the optics factor. And the donors have their own ways or variations of funding. In earthquake, we made arrangements to accommodate the donor variations. Some wanted to come and give the budgetary support, some wanted to help the NGOs, some wanted to do things bilaterally, whereas in case of floods, we said no, nothing else. Every money that the donor provides will be given as a budgetary support to the government, thereby losing out on a lot of goodwill that could be generated in shape of funding. And then, of course, we had a one-window facilitation operations after the earthquake, which we did not have after the floods of 2010. When you look at the two results, I think the achievements after the earthquake were outstanding, a role model by any standards, whereas we don't see the same in the floods of 2010. So my key point was that in both the cases, the PDNAs were done. But in one case, there was an effective recovery framework put in place, whereas in the other case, it was not done so. So the lesson that I want you to carry is that the PDNA and an efficient recovery framework go hand in hand together. You can't look at it in isolation. One gives you the recipe, other gives you the prescription. Now, some of the key recovery priorities that we had set after the earthquake was, of course, the stabilization of the services. Then we injected money through different procedures, livelihood cash grants, housing grants, compensation for deaths. And we realized that when you put money into the system, it generates an activity of its own, which helps towards normalization. So I think that's another key point that I would like to highlight. And of course, don't forget to harness the market forces. And when there is so much of destruction, there are opportunities. You have to rebuild really massive. So train the people. There will be, if you have abilities or capacities to develop skills of the people, those very people can be very optimally utilized during the reconstruction process, converting an adversity into an opportunity. And of course, don't forget the secondary disasters, and health is very critical. So we focused on health as well as road infrastructure, which was critically important to let the process of reconstruction go, because this was a mountainous area. If we didn't have the roads to carry the construction materials up, we couldn't carry out the reconstruction. Now, a word about recovery financing, and I think that's very critical. And early PDNA actually formed the basis for identifying the overall losses and the requirements that we had in every sector. And as I said, in one case, this was done within 5 weeks. And in another case, it had to wait for 5 months. And my takeaway point for you is, don't wait, because you want to perfect a document. Go for it. When there is sympathy factor, when the iron is hot, that's the time you will get the assistance. Otherwise, if you delay it unnecessarily, you're not going to get the donations that should be normally coming. We held a very successful donors conference, and you will be very glad to know, because we had made processes and procedures with an implementation mechanism, with an implementing agency, fiduciary safeguards, what will be the monitoring and evaluation arrangements. We got commitments in excess of our requirement. We needed $5 billion, and the commitments were made to $6 billion. And I'm very proud to say that we got all those pledges and commitments converted into final release of funds to the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehab Authority. Then, of course, we had dedicated donors and sponsor cells to accommodate the small assistances coming from philanthropists, from NGOs, from INGOs, from the corporate sector. And since we had made the arrangements, all that money ultimately became a big pot and was really extremely helpful in kickstarting the recovery process. So again, I think the key point that you need to look at is that you need to create arrangements where anyone who wants to help in any manner should be accommodated. Some of the guiding principles that we had, of course, full ownership of all stakeholders, including the line departments, the civil society, the affected communities, to ensure smooth transition. Because once you are doing reconstruction through dedicated institutions, ultimately it has to be handed over to the line departments. And there will be institutional resistance if you don't start to incorporate their viewpoints right at the start of the recovery. Mainstream DRR, and this is critical. We also need to take mainstream the environmental safeguards as well as the gender dimension. But you must remember that sustainable recovery leads to sustainable development, because sustainable recovery actually showcases that it can be done. And therefore, please make sure that you don't kind of give less attention to ensuring a resilient recovery. The point that I wish to highlight, the point that I wish to highlight is that during this process, all your policies have to be pro-poor, because it affects the poor segment of the population really hard, and they have very little coping mechanisms to fight back to such kind of disasters. Because of mainstreaming DRR, we had another great advantage which we observed in floods of 2010. Because the entire recovery was resilient, therefore the impact of floods in the same area was far less than some of the areas where we were going with the work as usual approach. Let me go to the next slide, and this is about the institutional arrangements. We had, as I said, a new dedicated body called the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehab Authority, And unfortunately, in 2010 floods, it was not the case. Another striking feature of our recovery was that ERA actually capitalized on the government servants, on the army, as well as the consultants from the market. Now, the government servants brought in the knowledge of government rules, regulations, and procedures. The army brought in the speed and the mass. They could inspect 600,000 houses that we had lost. And the consultants from the market gave us the intellectual input so that the process, when you look at the three kind of inputs and see a synergy is created, the impact is much more stronger than the sum of the individual three. The implementation was devolved to the provinces, and that is very critical because you need to have ownership of the provincial departments. And likewise, unless you develop customized processes of procurement, of contracting, of financial management, of a grievance redressal system, it will not work with your usual thing. So the key point that I want you to take away from this is that work as usual approach in a recovery operation is not going to work. You will have to come up with something extra, with a quality HR, with customized processes, with a team which is committed and can deliver, because you are doing something which is really time sensitive. Some of the issues that how we manage the programs, and I think the most critical point is second last from bottom, which is that all policy that you evolve has to be based on consensus. Consensus building is difficult, but once the policies arrived through consensus are put to the practice, everybody owns it and makes sure that it is done. Lastly, some of the lessons and good practices, of course, you need to have a dedicated organization. You need to have a very robust coordination and facilitation with all kinds of stakeholders, including the donors, the UN, the INGOs, and the government. A focus on community engagement and devolution and implementation. A very well articulated and a robust communication strategy. Then you need to see the relief, the early recovery, and the reconstruction as one continuum. If you divorce one from the other, you are going to create problems for yourself. There are a lot of international best practices lying outside your own country, and we are extremely grateful to the World Bank, to the Asian Development Bank. They brought those practices to the table for us to look at it and adapt if we were comfortable. And we adapted a lot of good practices from the rest of the world. I also feel that with imagination, adversity can be built into an opportunity, and we must prioritize and sequence the recovery operation in accordance with the need of people. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, General Nadeem. You can see how passionate General Nadeem is because of the experience that Pakistan has gone through. I wanted to also signal that on the far left of the panel, we've been joined by Dr. Suprayogo Hadi, who is the Deputy Minister for the Development of Special Regions in the Government of Indonesia and part of the Ministry for the Development of Disadvantaged Regions. And he is here to explain a bit more, a little bit how Indonesia has tackled reconstruction and recovery. I just wanted to ask you one question, Dr. Hadi. You've heard General Nadeem talk about a number of factors about involving the local population, about a recovery framework, about consensus on policy. I wonder, for you in Indonesia, what do you think has been the most important element in building back better? You've had a number of experiences at the national level. So what do you think is the number one thing that the audience needs to keep in mind? It should be on.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think this is going to be very good, the power of planning and budgeting in this case. We are talking about the planning because the assessment already been done, the PDNA, the HRNA, and also some assessment that already been done before. And then we formulating the master plan, for instance, like Aceh, and also the action plan for other disaster region. And also we are developing also the funding mechanism actually for that kind of situation. And as I said also in the previous featured event that Indonesia already been committed that 10% of the recovery process budget at least already been allocated for the DRR initiatives. So the DRR investment is come up with priority along with the process of the recovery process. And we also try to also adopt, like General Nadim mentioned, how the participatory process of the community-driven reconstruction process is also very powerful actually in making the process of recovery faster and also effective in this case.
So you found a way then to, in effect, mainstream the disaster recovery and the reconstruction in national policy.
Yes, it's already been very clear in our national policy, in our medium-term development plan, in our NEP-DRR, and also in every single national action plan for recovery. We put the DRR investment clearly there, that at least 10% has to be allocated for the DRR. That's why, for instance, like in the 2010 earthquake in Yogyakarta, we had that none of the building or the housing already been built since 2006 after the earthquake, the big earthquake collapse. So it means that we've already been investing the DRR in the reconstruction of the housing at the time.
Right, so there's proof that it works.
Yes.
You can say that it works.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And let me remind you that if you have questions for any of the people on the stage, that you have these papers, and if you have a written question, if you haven't tweeted the question or if you haven't emailed it, write it on the piece of paper and wave it. We have people on either side who will pick up the papers from you, either now or for the panelists that are coming later. Now, General Nadim, we have a bit of time, so let me just ask you. You heard Dr. Hadi as well, but when you talk about Pakistan, do you see this obviously as a development imperative as well, the Building Back Better, to mainstream that in development policy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there should be absolutely no doubt about it that you have to mainstream DRR, not only in the recovery process, but also do it in the normal development process. And we in Pakistan, with the help of National Disaster Management Authority, has been able to work out with the Planning Commission, as well 10 leading ministries which are involved in infrastructure development, that they have a complete kind of a questionnaire which they have to satisfy, like we used to have, the environmental impact assessment. Now you have the damage impact assessment as well. And I'm quite hopeful that once this culture sets in, it's just starting, it's not really mature, but just once the culture sets in, then probably our development should be as resilient. Additionally, then what Dr. Suprayogi said, even in our country, there is a percentage from every development budget which is earmarked for the DRR activities.
Very good. There was one question from the audience. I wanted to ask it of Mr. Kamioka. You have the translation. Okay. The question is, how does Japan make sure that new houses are seismically safe, that are prepared for the possibility of an earthquake? And how do you think developing countries who are looking to you, how can they make sure that what they build is seismically safe? They have many other priorities, obviously. So how do they make sure that their new construction is safe against earthquakes? Do we have the microphone on? Sorry. Can we turn on Mr. Kamioka's microphone?
Yeah.
Yes, now.
どんな地震が来てもですね、耐えられる建物を作るということで、免震構造という新しいですね、揺れを吸収する建物というものを今、作り上げています。ですからまさに日本の最高技術でどんな地震が来ても倒れないような免震構造の建物を今全部義務付けています。ですからきちんとですね、建築基準法という法律の中でしっかりと新しい建物に対してはどんな地震が来ても倒れないような構造、免震構造を義務付けているということと、ぜひこれからですね、各これから耐震免震構造をやられる方々には日本の技術を大いに使っていただいて、我々要請があればいつでもその技術を皆さんに一緒になって提供しますので、ただできれば津波が来そうなところにはですね、10メーター間隔で一つ堅固な建物を作っていただいて、 もう5分から10分以内でその建物に避難できるというような津波が来そうなところには最低限そういう避難所の高層の堅固な建物を作るということはぜひ義務付けていただきたいと思います。
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We're going to, I wanted to thank our panelists this part of the session now, that Mr. Sulistianto and General Nadim and Mr. Kamioka and Mr. Supraga. Thank you very much for taking part. Let's have some applause for their contributions. Now we're going to have a bit of a change here. So gentlemen, you will come down. Now I'd like to invite up to the stage, we have two people who are going to talk about the post-disaster needs assessment and about the recovery framework. And as General Nadim said, one is a prescription and one is also necessary. You need both of those at the same time in recovery. So we have Claes Anderson, who is the International Relations Officer for the Stability Instrument Operations Service for Foreign Policy Instruments of the European Commission. And we also have Mr. Raja Arshad, who is the lead disaster risk management specialist for GFDRR, which we all know is the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and working at the World Bank. So Claes Anderson, do you want to make your presentation first? Again, this is about the post-disaster needs assessment, the PDNA, and come up here. And then the, how that works with the evolving recovery framework. The international community is working to bring these both together for better reconstruction and recovery. So Claes, the floor is yours.
This now is actually, it's a joint presentation, as was said here, between the three organizations, UN, World Bank, and the EU, on the work that we do together with a lot of other partners as well on post-disaster assessments and their follow-up, recovery frameworks and so on. We have a formal cooperation between the three of us since late 2008. An agreement was signed that we do this work together, all the three organizations together. And the ultimate objective of that is, of course, to strengthen national capacity for disaster response and disaster prevention. Just a short recap on, I know most of you are very familiar with it, but a short recap of what a PDNA is. Starting with the assessment, bringing together assessment of the economic value of damages and the losses over time to the economy, with an impact on human development as experienced by communities, by the population. These assessments should, of course, also be done, and they should lead to a recovery plan, integrating both sides here, human, socioeconomic impacts, but also looking at productive side, infrastructure damages, and so on. This plan, should serve as a bridge, covering the period between immediate, let's say, humanitarian response and the longer-term risk reduction and development activities. So what have we done now since 2008, or rather early 2009? I mean, we've undertaken some 50 assessments together, the three of us, but of course also working with a number of other partners, governments and other partners on that. And the experience we have gained on this is developed into a joint guidance. And we are now at the stage of finalizing a joint guide on PDNAs. And I'll say a few words about that later. In some cases, PDNAs have also led to national tools being developed. And we heard earlier about Indonesia, even turning it into a law to follow these guidance. And I believe we will hear later in the panel from Kyrgyzstan as well, discussing these issues, coming into these issues. The PDNA methodology, whether it's general or developed on national level, can be used both for small and large disasters to develop the recovery and reconstruction plans, and Last here on the slide, but not least, it's of course a general theme for everything that we do, that all recovery, all reconstruction has to be done with a focus on reducing risks and building back better. So what are the key lessons that we have learned from all these number of assessments within our organizations, but also feedback we've received from other partners, from governments and other partners? If there's anything that should come out, it comes out on top, and if it's anything I want to underline even further, it is the key role that is played by governments and their commitment to the process, both when it comes to assessment and when developing recovery plans, reconstruction plans. The second here is the need for the assessment to be participatory, to include the needs and priorities of affected communities, really listen to their voice when it comes to needs, but also setting priorities on the recovery. It's important, of course, with a well-coordinated approach. I mean, there are many partners working on a PDNA and on developing a recovery framework, and we are actually devoting a section in the guide on this. We've recognized that this is a major issue, and we've dedicated a separate section there on how to work better together within the international community, working with the government and other actors in the process. It's important with the linkages between humanitarian and recovery, both when it comes to assessments and when the planning. That the assessments are followed through, not only assessments done, but also follow through with sufficient resources for recovery. That disaster, it was mentioned a couple of times before here, disasters can be a transformative opportunity. It can be an opportunity for change. There are very strong incentives to do the change immediately after a catastrophe has struck. So this can be a very good opportunity. We heard from the gentleman from Pakistan talking about sustainable recovery, then leading into sustainable development. You can see results like that coming up immediately, and that can also lead then to longer-term development done in a more sustainable way. The last point here about the efficient time frame. It was mentioned we should work when the iron is hot. We should respond when the iron is hot. It is, of course, very urgent to address the needs, to get economic activities going, but it's also often very politically important that you have a quick, appropriate response to a disaster. Whoop.
Is it time to change?
So, no, it's right. So when we have developed our guide, the new guide, what we have tried to do is not at all to invent new methodologies or new procedures, processes to go about it. It is really a collection of the lessons that we have learned here, and also using existing methodologies. Some of you have heard about the DALA, the HRNA, and so on. It's really to bring all of these together under one umbrella and to build on the lessons that we have learned here. This is a bit of an overview of the guidance that we have, that we are preparing, and actually it's almost ready now. Part 1 of Volume A here, that is really for governments and others who are involved in planning or launching a PDNA, while Volume B is more for sector experts who take part in the assessment itself. You see here the three chapters, the main chapters of Volume A: brief introduction to what is a PDNA, how can it be useful for a country to go through this process,
The second one is more how to mobilize, how to launch, how to plan a PDNA. And the last one, the third one there is what I said earlier about how to work together. Volume B will be a number of sector guidance notes covering in principle a large number of sectors: social, productive, infrastructure, and so on. Content of Part A is ready. So it is agreed between all of us, and it should be possible to have it out within a couple of months or so. For Part B, we are still finalizing some of the sector guidance notes, but it should be ready, let's say, by the end of this year or something like that. So the next steps. In order for these, our three organizations, fairly large organizations, there needs to be in some kind of an endorsement process within to be able to say that we are behind these kind of guidance. So that is starting now for the Part A, and it will start for Volume B very soon. In addition to that, the formal here, we also foresee something that we call like a rollout, building on this guide with capacity building activities, training, support at regional and national level. Based on this training, capacity building, we will also create rosters of experts that can take part in PDNAs. The third point here is development of a specific recovery framework guidance, and Raja will say much more about that later. The last point here, that's really to say that these guides are, of course, living documents. It's not once and for all. They are living documents. The intention is to incorporate lessons learned, experiences gained all along. So it's not a final version, but it will be a useful version as it stands now, but it's always to be a document in development, let's say that. Thank you.
Okay, continuing development. Thank you, Claes Anderson. Very good. So Claes, just come sit here. And now Raja Arshad from the GFDRR and the World Bank to explain a bit more about the evolving recovery framework. And as General Nadim said, one is a prescription, one is a recipe, but they go together, the PDNA and the recovery framework. Raja.
Thank you, Roger. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Just picking up from what the presenters have presented as well as what Claes has also just articulated, I will just sort of go over how the evolution is taking place between PDNAs and the next step, which is a follow-on, more detailing of the PDNAs referred to as the recovery framework. What we are seeing is that PDNAs have been playing a very important role in terms of giving an idea of the overall damage assessment, as the damages as well as the indirect losses, as has been explained. But there has been, over the years, we've seen that initially there was a very little focus on what kind of recovery strategies need to be put into place in these PDNAs. Then this whole process evolved, and we saw that there were some limited recovery frameworks in these PDNAs, but not to the extent where they were cross-sectoral or going into the sequencing and prioritization. More recently, what we are seeing is that PDNAs do have some kind of a recovery strategy built into them, and that is really helping countries take the PDNAs and translate them into some form of recovery planning. But what we are seeing, and this came across very vividly in the presentations that were made earlier, that there is really a need for some kind of a recovery framework that can help translate PDNAs into sustainable and resilient recovery. And this is in some ways being seen as the missing gap or the missing link. And of course, as has been pointed out very well in the presentations, the objective is to use these tools and methodologies immediately following a disaster, and in some ways also looking at them in an ex-ante manner before disasters happen, and the objective being that these recovery frameworks really help to move the whole recovery effort to influence and inform resilient development. And this point has been made time and again in the presentations, and we are now seeing this coming across as a continuum. Just to quickly go over how this has been building up, most of us were here in 2011 during the World Reconstruction Conference, and this was one of the hot topics of debate and discussion, need for filling this missing gap. And there was a very strong recommendation that came out during the WRC that there is a need for developing some kind of a methodology for the RF process or guide. There has been, since then, a consultative process that has been carried out. As Claes pointed out, the EU, the UN, and the World Bank have been leading this consultative process. We've been consulting with a range of stakeholders, and we have now reached the point where we were able to present this concept on the recovery framework in the International Recovery Platform Conference in Kobe early this year, where there was a lot of consultation that was held around this concept, and we are now moving forward in terms of presenting it to this August forum over here, and really, in some ways, launching the preparation of how this disaster risk recovery framework guide is going to be developed, how it's going to evolve, and how, in a very consultative manner, it's going to be taken to its conclusion. There are basically two objectives and outcomes that we are looking at which are related to the disaster recovery framework. The immediate objective and outcome is where we are looking at sustainable recovery. How can this disaster recovery framework inform and influence sustainable recovery? We see that multi-sectoral planning is something which does not normally happen in post-disaster situations. So this is one area that is going to touch upon. We also look at the challenges of aid effectiveness and aid coordination and aid harmonization. The recovery framework is going to provide the platform for that. And how can this be used as a funnel or a conduit for bringing in international good practices? So that's the immediate objective and outcome. But really the long-term objective and outcome is resilient development. How this small window of opportunity, when we have maximum attention of all key players, stakeholders, can be used to move the whole mainstreaming DRR agenda forward, and we can have a sustained policy dialogue between national and international stakeholders. And the resource commitments for recovery can also look at how subsequent resource commitments for development can be aligned. And we have examples, which some of them we've heard in the morning from the presenters as well. And finally, we see a disconnect between disaster response or recovery institutions and development institutions in countries. And the objective of this kind of a recovery framework is going to be to see how they start talking to each other so that whatever is happening in recovery is also being picked up in the development arena. The center of all this is recovery and reconstruction. One of the first areas of focus, and this can in some ways also be done in an ex-ante manner, so one doesn't need to really wait for a disaster to happen. This can be the thinking that can go into countries' strategies, programs, and other such mainstream papers on how a national vision needs to be developed for recovery and reconstruction, and then leading from there to development. A second very important area that can be touched upon in this is an extremely important area which sometimes goes missing is this whole focus on public, private, civil society, and other important stakeholders partnership. And this partnership is in so many areas. It's at the stage of emergency, relief, early recovery, medium to long-term, and recovery and reconstruction, and how this can be made more efficient, tapping on all these different, very important resources that are available, and in a manner where it can be more coherent. A third area where most of the countries usually struggle is the whole institutional arrangement for recovery and reconstruction. We've heard about this in the presentations that were made from the case studies from Japan, Indonesia, and Pakistan. This is one area which most countries take up when a disaster happens, but this is the thinking that can be put into place in advance of disasters in an ex-ante manner, so that the right institutional arrangement for whether it's a big disaster, a mega disaster, or recurrent disasters can be thought through, and when a disaster does happen, the right institutional arrangement can be immediately activated, and this is something that can be put into place on the very first day. Next is sequencing and criteria-based prioritization, and this is one area that we all know when a disaster happens, there's always this linkage between different sectors and how there can be sequencing and prioritization across these. So we have the financing and harmonization tracking, which can be linked to the recovery framework. We have how, once the recovery framework is ready, then projects can be derived from it, but those projects can be supported and they can be more integrated. And finally, of course, the monitoring and evaluation. This is the overall process that we are going to follow for developing this recovery framework guide. And it's really looking at doing a desk-based review of 30 country case studies, which we've already done. We are now going into the stakeholder consultation phase, which is going to last the next 2-3 months. And this will be part of the detailed country case studies that we are going to do in 10 to 12 countries. And then, of course, the timeline that we have is we expect to complete these case studies by the end of this year and expect to do the consultation and the finalization of this guide and hope to launch it in the planned WRC, World Reconstruction Conference, next year. My last slide really talks about institutionalization and how we can really help through this recovery framework to focus on national and international recovery preparedness and institutionalization. Greater financial resilience in an ex-ante manner, and that can be really something which can be very useful to governments in a more predictable manner. Third, more conducive policy environment, which can be put into place in an ex-ante manner. And finally, the very important continuum which exists between preparedness, recovery, and prevention. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Claes, and thank you, Raja. You can take your seats now because we're going to call up our panel. We're done now. I'm mindful of the clock, and I always like to have a session that ends just before lunch, because I think that we have such a good discussion that people can go to lunch and they can talk about what they've just heard. So let me now call up the members of the panel to give you something to think about while you're having lunch. First, we have Rodrigo Perez McKenna, who is the Minister of Housing and Urban Development and the Minister of National Prosperity for the government of Chile. Minister Perez, if you come here. Then we also have Mr. Kutabek Boranov, who is the Minister of Emergency Situations for the Kyrgyz Republic. We also have Genoveva Ruiz Calavera, Minister here, and Genoveva there, who is the head of the Unit for Stability Instrument Operations and the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments in the European Commission. And finally, at the far left of the stage, we have Francis Gisquier, who is the head of the GFDR Secretariat and the manager of the Disaster Risk Management Group at the World Bank. So welcome all of you. Thank you for being here. Ms. Vere, I know you came from Brussels this morning as well, so it's a very quick trip, but she has come especially to be part of this panel here. I wanted to start by asking you just very briefly, each of you, to explain in a minute or two just why this issue of recovery and reconstruction is so important for you from your national perspective for Chile and Kyrgyz Republic, and perhaps from the organizations that you represent, the European Commission and GFDR World Bank. Why is this such an important issue for you? So, Minister, you're first.
Thank you, Roger. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but well, Chile is a highly exposed country. We have earthquakes every now and then, and we went through a very severe event in 2010, February 2010. It was the 5th largest earthquake ever recorded. It affected 75% of the population. The damage was estimated in 8% of GDP. We had many roads, ports affected, hospitals, schools. It was very dramatic. 222,000 houses will have to be reconstructed by the government. That's equivalent to an 800,000 people population. So it's really a major task. And the reconstruction process was designed in 4 pillars, which I will state very briefly. First, strong government leadership regarding, for example, things like have a good assessment, have a financing structure, have a budget, consolidate all the different reconstruction plans. But that strong government leadership with a parallel, equal, important people's involvement, community involvement, private sector, construction companies at the same level of importance. Second pillar, focus on victims and not on the goods that were lost. And this is very important and will make the process much harder than what probably could have been if we don't consider that. For example, letting the people allowed to reconstruct in their own site, opening the door to people that were not really owners of houses, for example, were renting but didn't have where to go. That was a major issue. There are around 44,000 families in that condition. Open to participation, giving the right to choose is a key issue. So the second pillar is focus on the victims and not the goods that were lost. Third, using existing structures and rules. This is a very long topic. We can discuss later on this, but not reinvent the wheel and think what are the structures, what are the strengths of the current institutionality and legal framework that we have so that we can start right away. And fourth, and probably as important as the other 3, take this problem as a new opportunity to rebuild resilience. And in that front, we did many things like zoning, risk studies, defining new codes for houses more resilient, strengthening institutions, educate the populations. There's a tendency to underinvest in safe times, but you have the chance to invest just after an event. And we took this event as an opportunity to rebuild on a more resilient way. So, in summary, that's how we conduct the reconstruction.
Very good. That's a good overview of your approach. Now, that's the Chile story. Now, let me ask about the Kyrgyz Republic. Minister Boranov, what has been your experience? Just briefly, what has been your experience, and how do you approach this issue of recovery? And the minister will be speaking in Russian, so if you understand Russian, listen to him. If you don't, use your earphones.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
После
for
ситуации, после стихийных бедствий,
post-disaster situations,
вообще все мероприятия, которые будут проводиться, они очень важны.
All the work which is going to be done from every point of view is very important. The recovery period takes place, and in Kyrgyzstan we have a very simple solution. We have a whole system, a state system of civil defense. The chairman is the prime minister of the country. I'm also the Minister of Emergency Situations, and I'm his deputy. And all the other ministries and agencies of the country participate. All the ministers are members of the system of civil defense. And of course, everybody gets his own job, from the leaders of the system, and work all the way through transport, energy, finance, and all kinds of other areas. The most important thing is, I think, to assess the damage after the disaster, and then on the basis of the losses we've sustained, we analyze the situation, and then we begin, first of all, our rescue operations, and then we continue with other work. Thank you.
Very good, Minister. You said one or two things. I want to come back to you in the discussion after about your approach. Ms. Ruiz Calavera, European Union, European Commission, why is this so important to you?
Thank you very much, Roger. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with all of you.
Can we put the microphone on? Sorry, I'm not sure. Is the mic, can you start again?
Maybe I should take this out. Thank you very much. Working?
Now it is.
Yeah.
Now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roger. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As representative of the European Commission, I'm here in my capacity to represent the 27, very soon 28, with the accession of Croatia of July, European member states of the European Union. I think there are three reasons why it's important for us to be here with you today. The first one, of course, the European Union is a political actor with very far-reaching political, economic, and trade relations with countries and regional organizations around the world. And we're always willing to assist countries in disaster-prone areas that are in need of our help. I think the second reason is because the European Union feels it has a very wide toolkit ranging from humanitarian, early recovery, to long-term development instruments, together, of course, with our political relationships, that are helpful for countries in distress. And that, in addition to that, we are a partner which is fully supportive of the Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction at the multilateral level. And I think the third reason, which I would like to say, as you saw in the previous presentation by our colleagues from the World Bank and Klaas, who is a colleague of mine, is that we have, as an institution, the European Union is working very closely together with the World Bank and with the UN family to develop these methodologies that we hope very soon will be putting at your disposal in order to do post-disaster needs assessments together, of course, with countries. I was very pleased to hear General Nadim Mohammed. We were together in those assessments. But to develop methodologies that don't just become glossy brochures that think tanks will examine years from now to learn lessons, but methodologies that are properly linked to recovery frameworks, and that those recovery frameworks help build resilience for the long term, so big governance and, of course, political stability and peace around the world. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Now, Francis Gisquier, you're at the intersection of both development and disaster reduction recovery. Why is this recovery reconstruction so important to you from your point of view? On.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here as well. I think first it's good to remember that the World Bank itself was created as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so has a fairly large program, is regularly called to get engaged in post-disaster reconstruction operation. At the GFDR, which works with many other partners, there's also really a core program that deals with these issues. Probably 20% of all the activities funded by the GFDR deal with resilient recovery. Now, we may wonder why, indeed, do development agencies look so much into resilient recovery, especially, I mean, I think it's clear that recovery operations are first and foremost there to limit the suffering of affected population. But at the same time, I think over the years and through many, many studies, it's become very, very clear to us that effective, rapid recovery has a huge impact on limiting the impact of disaster on many indicators of development, on poverty, on inequality, etc. But most importantly, we really see disaster as, I don't like the word opportunity, but really as the time where you can move faster, you can try to change the status quo. The case of Pakistan, for example, after the Kashmir earthquake is a case in point in which, through the reconstruction of almost 500,000 houses using a technique that had been well identified of homeowner reconstruction, Pakistan has been able to change the building practices in an entire area of the country. And this has huge benefits to the future resilience of those communities and that part of the country. And I think there are many, many opportunities that can be seized after small and large disasters.
Okay. Very good, thank you. The use of a situation to improve the situation in the future. I want to ask you a couple of questions, panelists, but let me remind you again, in the audience, if you have questions, we've received a lot of questions. I have some of them here, and I'll be using them. But also, if you have any more questions for these panelists, write them on the piece of paper and wave them around, and people on either side will bring them up to me. All of the questions will be posted online. All of the questions will be answered. So if it isn't answered today, don't worry, we'll get to it online as well. I wanted to ask you, Minister Perez McKenna, about Chile. Now, we talked earlier, and one of the things you talked about was the role, some other people have mentioned, Indonesian friends, the role of the private sector. And I think Chile has been instrumental and in quite a good leadership position in involving the private sector in reconstruction. How did you do that? What are the things that you think the audience needs to know about the private sector?
Yeah, well, Roger, I think, well, first, the reconstruction process has done very well in Chile. It's around 90% advanced in the different areas. In housing, which is by far, in my opinion, the most difficult because it's 222,000, most of them different projects spread around 600 kilometers of the country. But one of the key aspects that has been good in this advanced process is the private sector role, which has been key. The private sector, the design of the reconstruction process has taken leverage of the private sector execution capacity and intelligence, with the leadership of the government, of course, but open to innovation and competition. And let me give you an example. We decided not to reinvent the wheel. There's a subsidy scheme in Chile towards social housing, which is mostly oriented to ownership. People normally, not under a reconstruction process, apply for a subsidy. I'm talking vulnerable people, and in a contest process, they get grants for a new house. But the private sector is the one that constructs these houses. So we decided to, in the reconstruction process, innovate over this subsidy scheme, and it was key. Normally, for example, a family that received a grant had to contract building a house according to certain standards. In this case, for example, we called the companies and say, look, we're going to certify certain types of houses, and more than 222 models were certified by the private companies. And what we saw is that we got better solutions and bigger houses because of competition. So, and in shorter tenors. So using a structure that was there, that existed, but innovating over that structure and opening it to innovation and competition was key. And the private sector has played a key role. We have more than 750 construction companies, most of them small and medium companies that are building these 222,000 houses, and we have finished 70% of the process. We are under construction in 26%, and there's 4% that has not yet started.
Okay. Now, when you talk about the role of the private sector, we're talking about leveraging their skills, leveraging the capacity, and leveraging funding, obviously. Mm-hmm. Funding is a key issue here, money. I wanted to ask Minister Boranov, when you go to meetings of your government and cabinet ministers, how do you convince people that you need the funding for reconstruction and recovery better, and you need to spend more money in order to build back better? Because you're having a debate all the time. They want money for their projects. You need money for your agenda. How do you convince them?
Thank you. Well, as I said, our system of civil defense has a special interagency commission, and all the other ministries and agencies in the Republic are involved. And after the damage assessment, the Commission works on the question of who gets how much money. And this is, of course, under the Minister of Finance, and the Minister himself is going to be convinced who needs what money for recovery and for overcoming the consequences of any given situation. And the Prime Minister will be participating, and he will be involved in distributing credit to the ministries. And that's how we deal with the question. And I'd like to add on another question. The minister from Chile was telling us how the private sector gets involved. We too get subsidies depending on the level of destruction of buildings, and the owners of the building, once they get the subsidies, will be particularly interested in reconstructing their buildings, their houses. And of course that will be under control. The subsidiary will be given stage by stage. And in this way, we bring in the private sector for the reconstruction following disasters. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Minister. Let me ask you then, Ms. Ruiz Calavera from European Commission. You've heard from Chile, you've heard from Kyrgyz Republic. Now, those countries have a certain maturity, a certain governance structure, a certain institutional capacity to deal with recovery and reconstruction. But I wonder about some of the countries that maybe are fragile states, countries that are in conflict, emerging from conflict. You're at the European Commission. How do you approach reconstruction recovery with those countries that don't have the institutions that these two countries do?
Thank you, Roger. That's a tough question. I think it's clear that undertaking both post-conflict needs assessment in a disaster environment and reconstruction is more challenging in countries which are fragile. I think in those countries, for us, what is important is that the causes that are interlinked in terms of poverty, fragility, vulnerability, need to be addressed in assessing how to go about recovery. And I think it's in particular important in looking into those interlinked, which are the root causes of sometimes political instability and conflict at the heart. We focus on them as a basis to provide assessments and to provide recovery frameworks that deal with the state building, because that's where we will have to be helping, and state building in an inclusive fashion, because we will have to be particularly attentive to equality between the communities that are being party to those conflicts or that have grievances that have not been addressed. And in addition to that, to inclusiveness of all communities, civil society, private sector, all, in particular in weak states, we have to make sure that all those voices are heard and factored in the recovery frameworks. Thanks.
Yeah, very good. Francis, I wanted to ask you also, now at GFDR and World Bank, there's all the talk about preparing for the next disaster and using that as an occasion or an opportunity to build back better afterwards. And a lot of the talk has been about preparation. Countries need to prepare themselves. But the key question is, how do they prepare themselves for something that they may not ever anticipate the consequences of? I mean, it's very difficult to know, how much damage, what will be the extent of the catastrophe. How could they possibly prepare?
Yeah, it's right. We get more and more called to try to assist government or municipalities or even communities to prepare for those large events. Sometimes I think they're well-advised department who want to do it, and still it's hard to convince the higher political sphere where, a politician may say, well, this is probably going to happen once in 20 years, once in 50 years. Why should I invest in this? It's probably not going to happen in my term of office. But I think it's important to understand that recovering from large disaster can only be done if it's based on, it's usually done based on dozens, if not hundreds, of small procedures and lessons learned and systems that have been set up in a society. And in fact, I think there's really a growing consensus that the loss from adverse natural event, from small events, from what we call extensive disasters, probably similar, if not superior, to the losses from large disaster. And in fact, there is value not just to look at the major big disaster, and indeed, in case of big disasters, there are systems to be put in place, but these systems build on the systems that are put in place by national government, by provincial government, by municipalities, to deal with the small day-to-day disaster. After all, every one of these small disasters for the affected communities, families, individuals are as dramatic as the major disaster. And so I think earlier our colleague from Indonesia mentioned this cycle of assessment, action, implementation, and learning. I think that if countries decide that they're only going to learn when they have major disasters, one every 20 or 30 or 40 years, the learning process is going to be pretty slow. But working at local level with municipalities, with provinces, with national government, systems can be put in place much, much more quickly, and these systems are the ones who then can be leveraged and used in case of much larger disaster, as it was the case in Chile, for example, the example you just mentioned about the safety net. So a lot of the work that we do is really about trying to set up those systems for small disaster, and then think, I mean, there must be a reflection on, well, what do we do in the case of the big one? But this always needs to build on the smaller element of a recovery framework.
Okay. Now, one of the questions coming from the audience is talking about this very issue about planning. So let me ask in general of the panel, the question is, which areas of recovery planning are the most difficult and usually the ones that cannot be managed very well? And I wonder from this, you hinted at it a bit, Francis, but I wonder, Minister or Minister Boronov or Ms. Ruiz-Calaver, which are the most difficult things to plan for you?
Well, I think institutions are key, and I think we faced like two dilemmas in this. One was, do we need really a czar of the reconstruction, like a special authority that was not created in our institutionality? And at the initial point, after the initial first 2 months, there was some sort of agency that was created by, I think, the president very smartly transformed it into a delivery unit in the secretary of the presidency that consolidates the different plans, housing, public works, health, education, so that each ministry has to have its own reconstruction plan, all this consolidated at the presidential level, but as a delivery unit, because otherwise, in our case, it was like creating a new layer of bureaucracy that didn't have enough execution capacity, so it was really slowing the process. So that's a dilemma. Do you rely on the existing institutionality? And among all the different areas, to me, by far the most difficult is housing. Housing and urban reconstruction is by far the most difficult. Public works, hospitals, schools, that is easier because it's a much lower amount of projects.
Minister Boronov, is that the most difficult thing for you, the planning about the housing in particular?
In principle, what I want to say is that any situation is very difficult to plan. And I think you have a whole complex set of questions, monitoring, and if the monitoring is good, then you'll get good results. Prevention, of course, would be very good. If there's good prevention, then if you don't have good prevention, then it's going to be very difficult afterwards. And I think the biggest difficulty is in the future to focus our attention on work in such situations to prevention, that is monitoring. And there really are some shortcomings there. And I think that is the most important thing for disaster situations.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Very good. I'm mindful of my Swift clock tells me that we're running out of time here, so I'm mindful of that. I wanted to ask you all just one very quick final question, and then we have a summation of the session. But one quick final question. If a country today were to have a natural disaster, and they came to you and said, what is the one thing that you should tell us about recovery and reconstruction? What would you say to them? Minister Paris McKenna, what is the one thing you would tell a country based on your experience that they need to pay attention to?
Well, it is really hard to say one thing because it's such a...
Pick one.
But I think one thing would be not reinvent the wheel, because time is such an important constraint. In our case, to pass a new regulation, for example, to have special powers or to have a special institutionality, would take at least 1 to 2 years. People cannot wait 2 years. You need to start right away. So in my opinion, it would be, think of what you have, how you conduct normal business, and build on that. Don't think of starting from scratch regarding institutionality, regarding the legal tools. You have to redo the thing. So that would be like one of the most important things. Of course, there are many others like private sector involvement, etc., etc. But that from the public sector, I think, is a key issue.
Okay, so work with what you have and move quickly.
Exactly.
Very good. Minister Boranov, what advice do you give to a country that says, what's the one thing we need to know?
Спасибо.
Thank you.
У меня один простой совет.
Well, I have one simple piece of advice.
Мы все понимаем,
We all understand
предупреждение
that prevention is much cheaper than overcoming the consequences. So you always need to concentrate on prevention.
Некоторые наработки есть.
We've done some work on that already. We've been working jointly with the World Bank, with UNDP, with the global platform, and now we have a special project to work in this area made up of 3 components. And we are going soon to construct a system directed towards prevention. Prevention is always better than cure. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Ms. Ruiz Calavera, one thing.
I will build on what Francis said before. Use the opportunity of the disaster to bring positive change, to work in an inclusive manner, that use that platform to address present challenges into the future, building back better, making sure there's more ownership and sustainability of what you're doing.
Okay, so turn a stumbling block into a stepping stone towards something else. Very good. And Francis, if there was one thing?
Of course, Veva took my main point. But coming back to your previous question and the biggest challenge, which really is more and more the coordination. Every context is different, but coordination is a major issue. And so I would tell my counterpart, you have to be in charge. And you have to make decisions. You're the one who really knows the context better. You know the institutionality, you know the mechanisms. You need to listen to people, but someone needs to be in charge and coordinate this program so that it moves forward and doesn't dissipate.
Okay, very good. A single focal point to make the decisions. Good. Okay, thank you, panelists. Stay where you are. Audience, we have Joe Schur, who is he's the coordinator for the Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery Team and the Bureau of Crisis Prevention and Recovery for UNDP. He's been sitting very patiently listening to these presentations, he's going to sum up everything that you've just heard. Joe. Should be on.
Yeah. Maybe I won't summarize everything because you will evade the room and rush for lunch, so I'm fully conscious that I'm standing between you and lunch. And I think you would agree with me that this was an extremely interesting and rich mix of experiences as well as forward-looking planning on how we can continue to do better. Let me say that I'm standing here as a staff member of UNDP, but representing the UN family. And the first point of summation, what I would actually like to make, following up right from this panel where the question was raised, why is this actually important and why is it important for a development organization? And I'd like to sum this up simply by reminding all of ourselves that disasters happen because development went wrong. And so if a disaster actually happened, we have an opportunity to set development on a different path that actually ultimately leads to better sustainable development outcomes, leads to poverty reduction, and leads to an improvement in the situation that we had before. And as such, it is core and central to what development organizations are doing. It is also clear from the presentations that we have heard here that we have come an extremely long way. And I would say the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005 was probably a tipping point for the international community in how we approach needs assessments and the recovery processes. I think it is also clear from these presentations that every recovery setting is actually different. There's many similarities in how we can approach them, but they're all different. And so we have to continue learning, continue adjusting, and continue, most importantly, with the partnerships that we have established, and make these international partnerships work for the national governments, for the local governments, and for the community. I think all the panelists made it very clear that what we bring as international partners has to work for these countries. I have a couple of very quick key messages that we've tried to distill from the discussion, and trust me, I will be brief. Recovery is not a choice. It is a development imperative, and we can plan for it. Just now, the minister from Chile, the honorable minister from Chile, mentioned the issue of the institutional setup. The representative from Pakistan earlier gave an example of how in the post-earthquake and the post-flood, the institutional arrangements were different and led to different outcomes. We can think about that beforehand. Indonesia has set a legal framework in place on dealing with recovery. Recovery is not just about building infrastructure and housing back. Recovery is about building back communities, improving the life, looking at the social impact and livelihoods. And we need to be clear that the private sector has an extremely critical role to play into this. At the session on the GAR 2013 yesterday, one of the findings of the GAR actually is that largely in recovery settings, we ignore in particular micro, small, and medium-sized businesses that can really be an accelerator for recovery. Again, that's a message that came out. We need to be very clear that we link the humanitarian response phase to the recovery planning at the outset, so that they really lead in a kind of continuum one into the other and not seen as two different sets of interventions. And finally, there's more points that we made, but the last one I would like to make two more key messages. It is an opportunity, the recovery, to integrate disaster risk reduction at the outset. Building back better has been mentioned, but what we have to do is simply look at the underlying risks and make sure we don't rebuild the same risk again. The final point on the key messages is one that is very dear to our heart as well, because if you look at the international architecture on our ability to support governments when it comes to recovery interventions, money is usually very tight. Pretty much all recovery plans are underfunded. Many of them concentrate mostly on infrastructure and housing. And we really need to figure out internationally how we can actually come with a recovery financing mechanism that fits between this humanitarian response frame and fits into the longer term development planning as well. So dedicated funding needs to be made available. With those few key messages that we will actually distill into an outcome statement that will be made available to all of you, I'd like to come and conclude by saying a couple of words in appreciation to all of the panelists, this panel, the previous panel, my colleagues that have given an update on the planning and the tools that we have been developing. I would like really to thank all of you that are still here, and those of you that have left and watched this over the video or read the statement, I thank you for having been here before. And last but not least, I think we really have to acknowledge the colleagues in national and local government, the colleagues of civil society and NGOs in communities that actually make recovery happen. We are proud to be able to work with them, and we continue to do so more in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. thank you to the audience. Okay.